Hello, friends. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Christy Scheib, author of NCFCA's debate curriculum and member of the debate committee. Today, we're going to be discussing an analysis of the NCFCA value debate topic with Dr. Art Carden. Today's webinar is being sponsored by FEE, which is the Foundation for Economic Education. The Foundation for Economic Education is a nonprofit educational foundation and has been trusted by parents and teachers since 1946 to captivate and inspire tomorrow's leaders with sound economic principles and the entrepreneurial spirit, with free online courses, top-rated in-person seminars, free books for classrooms, as well as relevant daily online content. Throughout this session, we invite you to ask questions by clicking on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. We'll have a time where Dr. Carden is going to answer your questions during our live Q&A following his presentation. If you need technical support, please contact us by email at tech@ncfca.org. That's tech, T-E-C-H, @ncfca.org. Also, stay tuned for an exciting giveaway from FEE that will come between Dr. Carden's presentation and right before we get into our Q&A time. So joining me today is Dr. Art Carden. He is a professor of economics at Samford University's Brock School of Business. In addition, he is a senior research fellow with the Institute for Faith, Work, and Economics, a senior fellow with the Beacon Center of Tennessee, and a research fellow with the Independent Institute. He's also a senior fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research. His research has appeared in the Journal of Urban Economics, the Southern Economic Journal, Applied Economics, Public Choice, and Contemporary Economic Policy, and his commentaries have appeared in Forbes, USA Today, and many other outlets. He earned a BS and MA from the University of Alabama, and an AM and PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. He's the co-author of Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World. That was published last year in 2020. So Dr. Carden, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fantastic to be here.
Great. We're looking forward to your presentation, and you can go ahead and start if you'd like.
All right, fantastic. Let's see. Let me make sure that I've got my screen share done. Everybody should be able to see. So you should be able to see a creeper from Minecraft and something talking about a curse upon intelligent machines, or should we adopt the precautionary principle or the proactionary principle? So it's fantastic to be here. I've judged a lot of NCFCA debates and things like that over many years. It's fantastic to be talking to you about exactly this proposition. And we're going to go a couple of places here. First, we're going to ask questions about whether or not the precautionary principle itself actually satisfies the precautionary principle. We'll say a few things about whether or not the precautionary principle would counsel something different today compared to, say, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. We'll say a few things about creative destruction and long-run economic change. I'll talk about retailing's creative destroyers specifically, some new possibilities and new opportunities. Then finally, we'll ask where the new opportunities might come from, asking, if I had $1 million, what might I do with it? So first, I want to ask a couple of questions about whether the precautionary principle satisfies the precautionary principle itself. In the beginning here, I'm asking about, I note a curse upon intelligent machines. And the idea of a curse upon machines comes from an 19th century French economist, Frederick Bastiat. And he wrote a fantastic essay called That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. And in the essay, he criticized a lot of the people who are making the sorts of claims that you're either going to have to A, defend if you're for the proposition, or B, critique if you're against the proposition, where people said, a curse upon machines, it'll take people's jobs. Eventually, we're all going to end up unemployed. And this sounds really, really, really familiar. Like, I think I've seen this before. It's like West Side Story. sounds really, really familiar. Okay, whether you call it West Side Story or Romeo and Juliet, it's fundamentally the same story. It was the same story in the 18th century and the 19th century as it is right now in the 21st century. And what Bastiat argues is that you have to take advantage of, or you have to take account of what is not seen when you're looking at or evaluating any particular act or policy. With respect to something like the precautionary principle or the proactionary principle, you have to account as well for what you might not be able to imagine, or what you might not be able to imagine as readily as you could if you're just kind of sitting around and thinking about what could possibly go wrong in the case of the precautionary principle, or what could possibly go right in the case of the proactionary principle. I want to consider each of these for just a second in light of Bastiat. Let's start with a case for the precautionary principle. Then I'll say a few things about a case for the proactionary principle, and I'll ask whether or not the precautionary principle itself actually fulfills the principles of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle, in so many words, basically says that we should be really, really careful about adopting innovation, because when we adopt innovations, people might lose their jobs, or some bad thing might happen, or we might end up with some kind of environmental disaster. It's really, really easy to see the costs of innovation. So to take the case of new technology, for example, it's really easy to see people who lose their jobs in steel mills. It's really easy to see people who lose their jobs to increased automation. It's really easy to see, or it will be really easy to see in a few years, truck drivers who lose their jobs because of automated trucking. It's a lot harder to see, though, the benefits that emerge from different kinds of innovation. And the benefits that emerge from increased automation of something like trucking would include lower prices for everybody, greater selection of goods, more new opportunities elsewhere. So if we're adopting the precautionary principle with respect to a certain type of technological innovation, then we might kind of be going at it with eyes wide shut. Okay? We might be doing the same if we're encouraging, or if we're urging upon people the proactionary principle. Because it's true that the very stuff of economic progress is creative destruction, but a lot of the things that might get creatively destroyed might be the kinds of bonds and the kinds of ties that make societies work well, okay? That draw people together, that first of all make life worth living, and that make it possible for future long-run economic growth and things like that. The precautionary principle would be defensible from, say, the perspective of someone like Frederick Bastiat, because there might be unseen hidden costs of innovation. In particular, in the 21st century technological environment, we have the problem of what we might call the gray goo possibility, which is the possibility that maybe nanorobotics, for example, leads to a slow but sudden transformation of everything in the universe into what's basically called gray goo. It just basically turned into nothing. It might also suggest, as we see in the increasingly integrated global economy, it might also suggest that we should be cautious about doing things like creating super bugs, something like a COVID virus, or creating or leading to pandemics, or doing something that would create a pandemic, like, I don't know, say making it a lot easier for people to cross borders and things of that nature. One could defend the precautionary principle on those grounds. Okay? One could also defend the proactionary principle on those grounds. Okay? And here I think there's a case to be made for creative destruction. There's a strong case to be made for embracing the proactionary principle, because so many of the problems that the precautionary principle seeks to address can perhaps be better addressed by being a little bit more proactive about things. So with respect to something like a pandemic, or with respect to something like the gray goo problem, or with respect to something like any sort of innovation that might create big costs for a lot of people, what we need in order to address those really big costs will often come from things like innovation. Will often come from things like being proactive about stuff. Moreover, and this I think is a really important way to think about the difference between precautionary and proactionary, we shouldn't necessarily privilege the status quo. The status quo is interesting, and the status quo has a lot of information content to it, but just because something is doesn't mean that it's optimal. And just because something is doesn't mean that that's the way that it should be necessarily. Furthermore, just because something is doesn't mean that we can't do better. And just because there are costs to allowing something like innovation, just as there are costs to allowing more international trade, just as there are costs to, say, opening the borders to more immigration, there are also massive benefits. Okay, one of the things that we've seen in economics is that in many cases, the benefits to being proactionary with respect to what we allow have exceeded the costs. And this is the essence of the book that was mentioned earlier that Deirdre McCloskey and I wrote, called Leave Me Alone and I'll Make You Rich, How the Bourgeois Deal Enriched the World. And what I'd like to do now is turn attention to retailing and then ask whether or not the precautionary principle itself actually satisfies the conditions of the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle itself, I don't think, really satisfies, or this is an argument you can make. The precautionary principle itself perhaps doesn't actually satisfy the principles that it espouses, because it basically stands in the way of progress. You might say, well, we don't want to take action unless we're absolutely certain that that action is going to be okay. But if you listen to the music of Rush, you know that in one of their songs, you say, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. And in this case, the choice not to act is itself an action. The choice to prohibit innovation is itself taking action in some sense. And being too cautious or acting out of an abundance of precaution might itself be worse than simply letting things go. So I'm really not sure that the precautionary principle itself fulfills its own conditions. We can apply this to something like retail. We can apply it to something like retail and the process of creative destruction that Joseph Schumpeter talked about in his 1940s book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. Retailing has been an industry where there's been an enormous amount of creative destruction and an enormous amount of people coming up with and trying new things. Many, many years ago, when you went into a retailer, when you went into a store, you would ask a person behind a counter to get stuff for you. It was relatively cumbersome. In the early 1900s, a store in Memphis, Tennessee called Piggly Wiggly invented, well, they didn't actually invent this. They were the first to really be successful with it, self-serve shopping. So shopping the way that most people shop today. It reduced costs. It made people's dollars go farther. Importantly, it created some costs insofar as companies like Piggly Wiggly that were adopting these new methods were replacing companies that were a little bit more hesitant to innovate or a little bit more hesitant to adopt new principles and new practices, but they were doing so in a manner that expanded people's possibilities. They were doing so in a manner that expanded people's possibilities. If we had applied the precautionary principle to early 20th century retail, then we might have stopped the innovations of companies like Piggly Wiggly, companies like the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, and we would have protected some jobs, and some ways of doing things, but at the cost of lower standards of living for everybody. Okay? When we think about lower standards of living, it's not just people having less stuff. It's also people having less food. It's people having less medicine. It's people having lower quality of life. I think that in the case of early 20th century retail, applying the precautionary principle to Piggly Wiggly, A&P, and others would have been a mistake. I think the same would be true of mid-20th century retail and late 20th century retail, to say nothing of early 21st century retail. At the cutting edge of creative destruction from 1962 forward, you'll find companies like Walmart, Kmart, and Target. They fundamentally revolutionized the way that people shop. Sam Walton, for example, who founded Walmart, thought that he could succeed by offering deep discounts to consumers in rural areas. And he was right. Target thought that they could also succeed by doing something similar with slightly more upscale goods in urban areas. And they too were right. An application of the precautionary principle to retail innovation and to Walmart expansion would have been to say, well, we're not sure we're going to let Walmart in unless we're absolutely certain that Walmart's going to be a good thing for our community. And this runs, I think, into a couple of different problems. First, it's not really clear what data you would look at in order to determine whether or not Walmart were a good thing or a bad thing, or how you would evaluate this trade-off against that trade-off. In 2009, some colleagues and I published a handful of studies of the relationship between Walmart and things like social capital, which is the networks of relationships that you have, people's values, and people's leisure activities. And we found that Walmart doesn't really have the deleterious effect that a lot of people were claiming. So first, it's not really clear that you would have the information you would need in order to act intelligently on the precautionary principle with respect to retail in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Moreover, embracing precaution in retail would have meant a lot of other harder to see costs. So in 2019, for example, another group of co-authors and I published a paper looking at the relationship between Walmart supercenters and food security. And we found that when Walmart supercenters open up, you in fact actually get more food security. And food security is a measure used by it's a concept that is sometimes measured by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and it basically says, do you have access to what they think of as adequate food, adequate nutrition, enough food, enough healthy food, fresh vegetables, things of that nature. It turns out again that an application of the precautionary principle to Walmart would have hurt a lot of people, and in particular, a lot of people of relatively modest means. We see the same thing in 21st century retail with Amazon. Amazon has ascended to about number 2 now on the Fortune 500. They're right behind Walmart. Well, not right behind Walmart. They're still considerably smaller than Walmart, but they are at the cutting edge as well of 21st century creative destruction. They're in some sense turning the world upside down and changing the way that people buy, changing the way that people sell, changing the way fundamentally, again, that people live. They're upsetting a lot of apple carts in the process. They're replacing old ways of doing things, but they're replacing those old ways of doing things with relatively new ways of doing things. And those relatively new ways of doing things are getting people more goods, cheaper goods, better goods, and ultimately higher standards of living. Fundamentally, the precautionary principle runs into kind of a knowledge problem insofar as in order to apply it completely, you have to have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge that cannot be known without experiment, that cannot be known without experience, that cannot be known unless we kind of let things run their course. So an abundance of precaution might satisfy some people and eliminate some problems, but it comes at the cost of creating others. Think again about new and different possibilities. Okay, we started with stone tools. Then people came up with new, interesting ideas. And we moved to iron tools. Okay. And perhaps this put the stone cutter tools, this put the stone tool makers out of business. But what it did fundamentally is it provided the world with a better set of tools and therefore a wider array of production possibilities. Over time, again, perhaps maybe we move from iron tools to diamond tools, which are even more durable still, okay? And which open up the world to even greater possibilities. Finally, again, perhaps we end up with netherite tools, which might expose the world to even greater possibilities than did diamond tools. It's not enough, I think, to simply say, well, netherite could be bad, and say we have to study this in greater detail and make sure that we're doing due diligence, I think you have to have a pretty compelling story for why netherite would be really, really bad. Okay, so maybe it causes cancer or something to that effect. It's not enough, I think, just to say this is something that could happen. You have to be able to defend that and say that it's something that's relatively likely. At the same time, however, if you want to defend the precautionary principle, with respect to things like new materials, you also need to be very, very clear that any set of innovations is going to bring cost as well as benefits. It could very well be the case, again, that netherite is radioactive, say, and therefore we want to make sure before we move forward that netherite isn't radioactive. It could very well be the case that mining netherite exposes people to a certain pathogen, okay, and we might want to be very, very clear that we're not exposing people to these pathogens by asking them to go forward and do things like mine netherite, or in the real world, mine things like the rare earth materials that go into things like cell phones, that go into things like computers, that go into things like iPads, that go into things like electric fans. There's at least a case to be made, I think, that understanding the effect of something like netherite on people's well-being is maybe something we should look into. But once again, I think when we're talking about production possibilities, and we're talking about the new sets of possibilities that are created by technological innovation, by the advent of new materials, the proactionary principle is, I think, going to win out over the precautionary principle. In fact, I think the proactionary principle might satisfy the precautionary principle even better than the precautionary principle itself, given what we know about the relationship between the last few centuries of innovation and people's standards of living. The world is getting bigger. The world is getting bigger. The world is getting much, much, much bigger. There's a net gain of one person every 22 seconds in the United States. Okay. There's more than one person, we add more than one person per second around the world. In 1979, when I was born, there were just under 4.4 billion people in the world. Now there's almost 8 billion people in the world. One might think that having all of these people would mean that all the jobs are going to go away. All the jobs are going to go away. We're all going to starve to death. We're going to put stress on resources. What's happened over time, however, is that real prices have fallen. So inflation-adjusted prices have fallen. And moreover, again, if we look at the employment to population ratio in the United States, it is anything but consistent with the hypothesis that more and more and more and more and more and more people will mean fewer jobs, or will mean what Karl Marx called a reserve army of the unemployed. There's this precipitous drop here in 2020 due to the COVID pandemic, and one that we are recovering from, albeit relatively slowly. But here, one could argue that embracing the precautionary principle and shutting down the global economy had a lot of long-term effects that may not have really been so great. Now we might wonder, where are these new jobs going to come from? Where are these new jobs going to come from? Well, in the late 80s and early 1990s, a band called Bare Naked Ladies, a Canadian band, wrote this song called "If I Had $1 Million." And they asked people to consider what would you do if you had $1 million? And so you've got a guy who's singing to his beloved, singing, "If I had $1 million, I would buy you an emu, I would buy you a green dress, I would buy you sausage, I would buy you bacon, I would buy you Kraft dinner, I would buy you fancy Dijon ketchup, and all sorts of other things." If we want to know where are the new jobs going to come from, where are the new opportunities going to come from, doing an exercise like this might help a lot. Saying, what would I do if I had an extra $10, an extra $100, an extra $1,000, an extra $1 million? And thinking about what we would do with those extra dollars would be a very, very good way to understand where some of the new opportunities will come from in a world that embraces creative destruction. Are we going to be replaced by machines? Or are we going to be replaced by artificial intelligence? Well, the way that the economic historian Joel Mokyr puts it, something like Google is the world's best research assistant, but it's probably not ever going to be the world's best researcher. So what we've seen in embracing intelligent machines, in embracing technological change, in embracing what Deirdre McCloskey and I call the bourgeois deal over the last century and a half or so, has been the development and embrace of a set of tools and technologies that make us more productive, okay, that assist us, in other words, instead of replacing us. The way that Frederick Bastiat puts this, he says to curse machines is to curse the human mind. I think the same thing is true of artificial intelligence. The same thing is true of innovation. And the same thing, frankly, is true of many of the things that the precautionary principle is trotted out in order to oppose or in order to question or in order to thwart. This doesn't mean that the precautionary principle is indefensible. It does, however, mean I think that there's a much stronger case to be made for the proactionary principle. Now, I know that a big part of what you guys are supposed to be doing is preparing cases for both sides. So at this point now, I'm going to open it up to questions and answer any questions you guys might have about some of the claims that I've made here over the last few minutes, and furthermore, how you might rebut some of those claims.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Carden. I really appreciate
Thank
that. Go ahead and start thinking about the claims that Dr. Carden has made, how you might interact with that, what questions you might have about it, what pushback you might have, and enter your questions into that chat button down at the bottom of your screen, and we will collect your questions while we do this giveaway from Fee. I'd like to introduce Miss Hannah Langdon. She is an NCFCA Region 6 alumnus, and she also works with Fee on their outreach team. So thank you for being here, Hannah, and thanks to Fee for sponsoring this webinar today.
Thank you so much for hosting us, NCFCA. Thank you, Dr. Carden, for that presentation. Sorry, there's an echo right here. Get that taken care of. Turn the volume down, please. Thanks. I'm here with my club today, and we've all been enjoying the talk too. So yes, we have a giveaway for 2 people who've participated in this webinar. You'll get a copy of Economics in One Lesson, which is a great way to get the economic background for this resolution, and some swag from the Foundation for Economic Education. And our lucky winners are Darcy Crenshaw and Andrew Wales. So Darcy and Andrew, if you could email me, I'm going to put my email in the chat, hlangdon@fee.org, and I will get you information to collect your prizes. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Hannah. And thanks to Fee for being our sponsor and for those great gifts. I personally have my copy of that book and refer to it all the time. So it's a great resource. So let's get to your questions. I have one that came in. This is the question, Dr. Carden. Would your perspective change on what you've just shared with us if we applied these principles to medical innovation as opposed to retail innovation?
Okay. So that's a really, really good question. And I've been trying to think of ways that I would defend the precautionary principle. And I really like the medical innovations point because of questions related to bioethics. So just because you've heard it said, just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should.
Right.
And if we're asking questions about, say, things like abortion, or if we're asking questions about things like genetically engineering people in the womb and things of that nature, then the precautionary principle becomes a lot more persuasive. The reason it becomes more persuasive is because of just the possibility of sin. In some sense. There's a philosopher at the University of Maryland, actually, named Dan Mueller, who has a really interesting paper from a few years ago, I think it's on abortion specifically, saying that we need to take, or more people need to take seriously the possibility that this is wrong, and that in doing this, you're doing something that's we're all doing something that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to something like medical innovation, I think you have to get pretty far out there though before the precautionary principle really has a whole lot of weight. If you're talking about something like, you know, crossbreeding humans and sharks or something, okay, that's where the precautionary principle might have a little bit more oomph. If you're talking about something like you know, having, I don't know, creating a better version of Tylenol, then maybe not so much. But I do like the medical innovation point as a potential counterpoint to thinking about the proactionary principle. The way that you want to think about doing the calculus, though, would be to ask what specifically are the likely costs of this particular innovation, not necessarily what is something that we can imagine. So we've read or seen Island of Dr. Moreau, for example. Okay, you see these hideous genetic experiments, but how likely is it that these are going to be the things? How likely is it this will end up in that sort of scenario? I would also say too that with respect to defending the precautionary principle, also two very strong cases for the precautionary principle would come from climate change and pandemics. So right now, of course, we're what, a year and a half into 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? So well, gosh, almost 2 years into this now. And if the lab leak hypothesis is correct, and in fact, the coronavirus pandemic happened because the virus escaped from a lab that had basically the same protocols as a dentist office, then that's going to suggest perhaps a different application or a more rigorous application of the precautionary principle. Climate change would be similar. If there is let's see, and this is of course a politically fraught issue, but if there's a decent possibility of, say, the end of life as we know it,
Mm-hmm.
say, as a result of sudden climate change, then then we might want to think harder about this or that innovation. Again, though, with respect to climate change, I think one of the major things that's driving it, of course, is fossil fuels. But had we not applied the precautionary principle to nuclear power, then emissions wouldn't be anywhere near what they are right now.
Right. That's a lot of food for thought. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking a little bit
Sure.
about just like the philosophical background of these
Mm-hmm.
positions, would you say that the proactionary principle adopts a more utilitarian view of things, that, you know, technological progress is justified unless it causes extreme harm?
Mm-hmm.
But then what would you say, like, how much harm is necessary for the proactionary principle to warrant refraining from innovation? Do you have any insights in that?
Yeah, I think it's with respect to where we are locally, or with respect to the amount of innovation we have now. I think it would have to be something very, very extreme. It would have to be, are we talking about a decent chance of the extinction of the species, say, or are we talking about sort of a fundamental redefinition of what it means to be human? Where I'm suspicious of the precautionary principle in a lot of cases is that it tends to be trotted out by people who would lose as a result of a particular type of change. So there's an economic historian named Sheila Ogilvy who has a really fantastic book, came out a couple of years ago, on the medieval guilds. I reviewed it for the American Institute for Economic Research. You can find that on the AIER website. But you see argument after argument after argument after argument about how people should, we need to restrict this particular occupation to just men because we don't want bad things to happen to women or whatever. It's okay, well, the side benefit of that is you reduce output and increase the wages of the people in the protected industry. So so a lot of times I hate to say this, but the precautionary principle might be a cover for special pleading. The proactionary principle can be as well, where someone says, the reason that you need to subsidize me or the reason that you need to give special tax privileges to my company is because we want to be innovative and things like that. But I think the precautionary principle is probably more frequently used in that way.
Right, right. Speaking of that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the values that drive these different positions, because that's really kind of the core of what we're debating here with value debate. So, so if you could speak to what do you think is, and let's say in the best case scenario, because like you just mentioned, maybe there are other reasons that are motivating people, but in the more altruistic scenario, what values do you think are driving both sides, the proactionary side and the precautionary side?
Yeah, I think what drives the proactionary principle is just an embrace of the new, combined with a humanitarian insistence on solving problems that have plagued humanity forever. I think you can say the same things, the same values are driving the precautionary principle, not necessarily a fear of the new, but an understanding that the past, that traditions, that things like that have a lot of information to them. So G.K. Chesterton has this really fantastic thought experiment. And here, if I were defending the precautionary principle, I might invoke this. So Chesterton says, okay, if you encounter a fence in the woods and you have no idea why it's there, make darn sure you know why it's there and what problems it solves before you knock it over.
Right.
And that I think is wise. And when I think about say another good application of the precautionary principle in light of Chesterton, it might be to something like social institutions. So let's see, what are some things that, I don't know, when you look at the world and say, I'm not sure how that makes sense. Maybe the presumption that it makes sense or that it solves a problem you can't articulate would be worthwhile. In the 20th century, well, the 19th century and 20th century, this actually went really, really haywire with the advent of, or sort of the ascent of communism, because people would look at something like relationships between families and say, well, there's no objective reason why you should prefer someone who's genetically close to you to someone who's genetically far from you. Therefore, we can re-engineer society. And I think in that case, people not understanding the information content of existing rules, norms, and practices help to create some very, very serious problems and kill lots and lots of people.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you make some good points there. So as I've been studying this issue, I've noticed that if you talk to a person that's a fan of the precautionary side, they're quick to say that they're not against all innovation, right? But then if you talk to the proactionary person, they're quick to say they're not against all risk management, right? So they're both, well, no, I'm not against mitigating risk, or I'm not against innovation. So what in your mind, how would you articulate what is the major difference, though, between the two principles?
One embraces innovation much more readily. The other embraces innovation much more reticently. Saying I'm not against all innovation is a bit of a dodge, or saying, I'm not against all risk management, again, is a bit of a dodge. It's like saying something like, I don't know, I enjoy eating Chinese soup dumplings. And saying, well, yeah, but ravioli's good too. It's like, well, okay, that's true, but irrelevant. I think it's basically the degree to which people are willing to embrace the new. And one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot in this discussion, again, is social institutions. So the way that a friend of mine put it a few years ago, one of the really interesting things about modern conservatism is that the principles that it's trying to conserve are very, very radical. In particular, so like the notion of equality, the notion of participatory governance, things like this, all this stuff that happened during the Enlightenment that was a massive, massive, massive break from the way that things have had been done before.
Right. Okay, I think that's really helpful. Here's a student who would like for you to dig a little bit into the concept of creative destruction. If you could define that concept and why it's essential for progress.
Okay, so I posted a link in the chat to the Wikipedia page, which is not the definitive source, of course. It's a good place to start for thinking about creative destruction. But creative destruction is it's a term that was popularized by Joseph Schumpeter in, let me kind of back up here a few slides, in 1942. Okay, so this is Schumpeter, and it basically says that progress happens, or any sort of change is going to replace old ways of doing things with new ways of doing things. So to use the example of automobiles, for example, the automobile is a new way of doing things, but it destroyed an entire industry. So in fact, actually, while I'm thinking about it, let me go to something. So the Fraser Institute has some really, really nice resources on this.
And if you'd like to share your screen again, then we can see
sure.
that.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm just going to post a link in the chat.
Oh, link in the chat is great. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
Excellent.
All right. Yeah, so that's something you might find useful.
Okay, good. How would you respond to the argument that we need to use the precautionary principle because failure is always a part of innovation, right? And so we need to use the precautionary principle to make sure that we can test innovation safely so that failure doesn't hurt society as we're innovating.
What's the right amount of safety, and who gets to decide? These are important questions. Safety, in a lot of ways, is in the eye of the beholder, and we run the risk. We run the risk of committing. I can never remember the difference between a type 1 error and a type 2 error. One of them is a false positive, the other is a false negative.
Okay.
And the regulatory environment is shot through with these problems because approving a bad drug is deadly, but also failing to approve a good drug or failing to approve a quote unquote safe drug is also deadly. With respect to the coronavirus pandemic, again, we're almost 2 years into this now, and we still don't have automated drone delivery from Amazon and places like that, which, if we were really serious about contactless delivery, this would have been approved a long time ago. Or in the case of ride sharing, I remember when we were having this debate in Birmingham, I remember somebody saying, well, you don't know who you're going to get in the car with. That could be an axe murderer. It could be a serial killer. It's like, well, if so, then that's the dumbest serial killer on the face of the earth, because you're being tracked in real time via GPS. You get the make, model, license plate of the car, pictures of everybody. It's every bit as much of a mistake to refuse to permit a quote unquote good innovation as it is to prohibit a bad one. And that actually gets to a question that Noah asked me in the chat, said, how is the choice not to act an action in itself? Not to get too philosophical about it, saying we choose not to approve Uber or Lyft is to say we're going to punish people who use Uber and Lyft, and we're going to sort of go on with the status quo, which it turns out is actually less safe than the alternative.
Yeah, I think that's important for students to think about the consequences of, so kind of the opportunity costs, right? Of missing out on the innovation. Right, good. Here's a question from Ellie. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say another good example here is the war on terror. I'd have to look and see what the most recent data are, but one could argue that the increase in airport security after the 9/11 terrorist attacks is responsible for more deaths than people who actually died on 9/11.
Wow.
not insofar as like the TSA is actually going out and killing people the way the terrorists did, but by having so much more new airport security infrastructure, it became a lot less convenient to fly. And what's a substitute for flying? Driving. And driving is one of the most dangerous things that people do on a regular basis. And so the economists who've looked into this, and this is one of the reasons why everyone hates economists, did some estimates and found out that, you know, within, I forget the time frame, but more people have died as a result of auto accidents induced by the TSA than were killed on 9/11.
Wow.
So, yeah. So we might say, oh, precautionary principle, we need to have all this airport security so that nobody blows up a plane. Well, you know, the body count from this exercise in the precautionary principle is now higher than the body count from 9/11 itself.
Mm-hmm. How would you apply this thinking to weapons? One of our students is asking about innovation in weapons manufacturing. Do you think that might lend itself to more precautionary thinking?
Yeah, that's a good question. And so there's a really great clip from The Simpsons where Professor Frank, one of the scientist characters in the show, is talking about his death ray, and someone says, "Are you really sure you should do this?" He says, "Well, you know, it does only have evil applications." Okay, so
right.
yeah, so if you're talking about innovation in weapons, then yeah, the precautionary principle probably better applies because weapons are specifically designed to kill people and break things. If you're talking about innovation in cell phones, maybe not so much. But if you're talking about innovation in something that is specifically being used to do one of the most horrible things that people do to each other, then then you probably do want to be much more careful than you would if you're just trying out new soup recipes.
Right. Exactly.
Okay.
Let's see. So this is from Thatcher, a student. How does the proactionary principle respond to the possibility of irreversible negative impacts?
We have to say a little bit more than just possibility. There's a lot of things that could happen. It has to be, I would say it has to not just be something we can imagine happening. It has to be something we can imagine happening with a relatively high probability or a high enough probability to matter. Again, let's use this, and let's get down to brass tacks here, because this is one application of the precautionary principle is, say, things like sexual abuse in churches. And that's a huge, horrible thing. It's a horrible thing. Whether or not it happens frequently enough to be something for people to for everyone to completely turn over how they do things is another question entirely. So you do want to take a lot of caution in that sort of case, but you also want to apply the precautionary principle, we'll say, to the possibility of overreaction. So you pick any utterly horrible thing you can think of. Right. Sexual abuse in churches, terrorism, you name it. You can construct some sort of example like this. The mere fact that you can imagine something horrible happening doesn't mean that horrible thing is likely to happen, or, and this is really, really important, that there's an alternative that's safer. So again, if we think about churches, children are probably much safer in churches than they are in public schools. Say.
Right, exactly. Yeah, just comparing it to other contexts, perhaps.
Right.
I think Emmett has just submitted a really interesting question. If it's deadly, there's deadly consequences potentially to approving bad innovation, but also deadly consequences from holding back good innovation. Is there a filter or some kind of standard we can use to prevent both problems? I think that's kind of the crux of this debate is how do you measure that? What are good principles or criteria we can follow?
So this is where there really isn't one. This is where common law embodies a lot of wisdom. So Friedrich Hayek wrote a fantastic book, and it's not published in 1960, I think, called The Constitution of Liberty. And then in the 1970s, he published a trio of books elaborating on similar themes. And one of the things it discusses is how decentralized legal systems, free people in free markets, come up with what might be the right way, and I'm going to put right in very, very big quotation marks, to address particular issues. So right now, I'm actually, I listen to Tim Keller's sermons when I walk the dog in the mornings. And he's, right now, the series that they're putting on their podcast is about wisdom. And the way that they're defining wisdom is not in terms of knowing abstractly what's right and wrong, but knowing how to do the right thing when you don't know what the rules are. And the question I think is not what sort of hard and fast thing do we apply to every situation, but what are the institutions by which we make these decisions?
Interesting. Okay, I appreciate that. I think I've got a good question here from Christopher, and it's kind of getting to that same philosophical, moral kind of a question. When it comes to machines, and I would just say not just even machines, but innovation in general, is it worth people's lives for innovation that could save more lives? Kind of one of these questions like, well, if these few people have to die so that more people could live, is that morally acceptable?
Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. And it's one where I'm not sure you can do the calculus the way that people would want to do the calculus. If you're talking about something like, and this is a point, so something Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote about, said, so imagine you could have your perfect world, but you have to torture a child to death to get it. Okay, well, most people would agree that that's wrong. If you're talking about the sort of long-term, disconnected, unintended consequences of, I don't know, say something like driving home from work, where there's a non-trivial possibility I'm going to kill myself and somebody else driving home from work. That's something we do frequently without even thinking about it. I think it's going to be context specific. I think on one hand, there's the sort of jettisoning of morality that would say, okay, yeah, sure, torture as many kids to death as you can in order to get this utopia. But then also there's also something that would absolutely halt any action whatsoever, because we have to make absolutely certain that it harms no one in any way, shape, or form, and that's simply not practical. But that's a very, very good question.
Yeah, I think it's worth exploring, and I'd encourage the students to keep asking those questions and reading. And I appreciate how you've been mentioning some authors and books to read, and hopefully people are paying attention to that. Let's finish up today with a final question from a parent. So I've been seeing some comments where they're thinking, okay, how do I compare? So our parents often judge, right? Just like you've judged.
Yes.
And so you're going to have, one student talking about we need to use caution in the area of medicine, and the other one arguing, well, we need to innovate in the area of technology and retail. So how do they compare apples to oranges, if, as it were? Like, do you think that the one or the other principle is true most of the time in most contexts? Can we find a generally true principle here?
I tend to lean toward the proactionary principle in the commercial space and the precautionary principle in the political space. So social revolution, saying let's turn the whole world upside down. Let's sing John Lennon's Imagine there's no heaven, imagine there's no countries, imagine whatever. Okay, fine. Like I can imagine that, and it's hell on earth, because that's what happened in the 20th century. Similarly, with respect to things like commercial innovation, I can imagine a better type of Cheerio that hurts some cereal companies because they can't make the better Cheerio or something like that, but that ultimately makes the world a better place. So if I were in, one of the things I love about doing stuff like this is it helps to clarify my own thinking on these things. I would lean more toward the precautionary principle in the political space and the proactionary principle in the commercial space.
Okay, that's great. That's helpful. And as
Mhm.
far as specific questions, I'll just say to our audience about how you would judge that or what that means for your debating. Go ahead and write your questions to the debate committee. You can write to us at debatecommittee@ncfca.org, and we can answer your more debate specific or theory specific questions through the debate committee. Well, Dr. Carden, I've really appreciated your time today. I think you've given us
All right.
a lot of excellent resources and food for thought. And so as we close, I just want you to take, for all of our listeners, take a moment to write in the chat box, what is your one big takeaway from today, from this webinar? I would say I really appreciated, Dr. Carden, when you said that we shouldn't privilege the status quo in this debate, but just because something is doesn't mean that it should be. And I think that can apply to both sides of the question, that I would encourage students to think that way. What should be, just because something is doesn't mean that's what we should have. So I'd be interested to see in the chat, the students, what you think, or parents, your takeaway for today. Again, Dr. Carden, we thank you so much for being here. And affiliates, our competition season is right around the corner. If you haven't already done so, consider signing up for one of our winter warm-ups, where you'll have the opportunity to kickstart your season by practicing your speeches and debates on the NCFCA online platform. So check your NCFCA dashboard for details about registration. And thanks so much to all of you for joining us today. I hope you all have a fantastic day.